Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for all those in attendance this afternoon, and welcome to the second in this series of transport lectures for the Worshipful Company of Carmen through our Education Committee. So thank you all for joining. We're delighted to have with us this afternoon Steve Gooding, leading us this afternoon in this most interesting subject of driverless futures. I'm sure you'll all agree that only a couple of decades ago, and perhaps even a bit less, this was thought to be perhaps on par with perhaps spaceships landing on Earth. And here we are, driverless futures are almost with us. And now we're about to hear all about this undoubtedly wonderful subject. It will open up so many opportunities in all aspects of our work and our lives. And without further ado, I hand over to you, Steve. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to speak to you this afternoon. It's an honour to be with you. I'm only sorry that we're not meeting in person, but just meeting on this rather strange sort of checkerboard screen that we're all starting to get used to in the world of Zoom. Some of you will know my background. I'll just say that for many years I was a civil servant in the transport department. I've been the director of the RAC Foundation for 6 years now, which feels like, on one hand, quite a long time, and on the other hand, not that long at all. But it's been an interesting time, and it's been I would say, something of a tumultuous time in the world of motoring and what the future of motoring might be. So this idea of driverless futures, when I arrived in 2015, I heard people confidently predicting that the fully autonomous car would be with us by now. And I just had a look out the window, and I hate to tell you that it's not there. Not yet. It might be coming. But this is an interesting week to be talking to you about this subject, because, of course, this week we're hearing that the first on-road driverless taxi service is actually happening in this country in Milton Keynes. Some of you might have seen the coverage of this. It's driverless in the sense that there is an emergency driver in the vehicle, but they're not holding the steering wheel. And there's a remote driver who has multiple screens, and through the multiple screens at their desk, they're able to view through multiple cameras the world around the vehicle, and they can control the vehicle. So it's not autonomous, it's not automated, but there's no driver in the vehicle. And I think this illustrates something that I think possibly has made grappling with this subject more difficult, which is a lot of loose talk about driverless cars or autonomous cars. But actually, we're talking about a number of different things. So what I thought I'd do was to whistle through 6 things that struck me as being of interest about the subject of a driverless future. Let me kick off then. Driverless technology. It all sounds wonderful when you hear Elon Musk talking about it. And maybe there are many big advantages to be had out of moving into a world where none of us humans has to operate these big, heavy, dangerous machines, particularly on public roads where other people are moving around. And undoubtedly, there are potential benefits to be had, and I'll come back to that. But where I thought I would start is with today. So today we've got the trials of the driverless taxi happening in Milton Keynes. We've had some trials happening around the country of various aspects of autonomy of vehicles. But the one that's really closest to us in terms of a vehicle literally driving itself is the automated lane keeping system. Now, the automated lane keeping system, or ALKS as it's charmingly called, is a system which has now been approved by the UNECE. So the body that gives type approval to vehicle technologies have said, this is okay. And the automated lane keeping system basically is a system that enables a vehicle on a motorway. I'll come back to the definition of that if you wish, but just having in mind, you're on a motorway, the traffic speed has dropped below 37 miles an hour. You are bored and frustrated, But if you press a button, you can let the vehicle drive itself, and you no longer have to be concentrating. You can be thinking about something else. And our government, which, although we've left the EU, is still part of the UNECE and is still almost certainly going to stay in step with EU vehicle standards, has been fretting over how to accommodate this technology, how to not just allow it onto our roads. It's going to come, the vehicles are going to be equipped with it, but what do we say to the drivers? What should, in British law, what view should we take of a vehicle that's got this automated lane keeping system fitted and it's been activated? What should we allow the driver or the person in the driving seat to do while the system is activated? Who, if anyone, is liable if something happens, something untoward happens when that vehicle is involved in a collision? And I don't think any of those things are terribly clear at the moment. One of the things that's concerned us most at the RAC Foundation is the concept that if the automated system is triggered, the vehicle is now driving itself. So what it will do is it will stay in lane. It can sense where the lanes are, so that's good. It can make sure you don't depart from the lanes. It will make sure that you don't run into the vehicle ahead, because it will moderate the speed of the vehicle. So it will steer, it will accelerate or brake. But what happens, for example, if, as does sometimes happen, it's happened to me, something falls off the back of the flatbed truck in front of you and the vehicle has to swerve? Well, it's not going to swerve because it's not going to leave the lane that it's been programmed to stay in. It's going to slam the brakes on. And the default, the default for the vehicle encounters a problem, what will it do is it stops in lane. Now, in another part of the forest, there is any amount of debate going on about the issue of all lane running on motorways and the problem of vehicles stopping in lane. Personally, on that occasion, when I was coming up behind a vehicle and something fell off the back, I wanted to swerve around it. I did not want to slam the brakes on, and I certainly didn't want to be rear-ended by the vehicle behind me. And I think that's a risk. Second, in any circumstance where a vehicle that's able automatically to drive itself doesn't really know what to do, but for whatever reason, and I will come back to this, can't hand control back to a human driver, I wanted to take me to somewhere that's genuinely safe. And that doesn't mean stopping in lane, particularly if that lane isn't even the inside lane, which is entirely possible with the AUX system. So I'm a bit suspicious of it. Now, others are rather more enthusiastic. On the upside, I would say that the big step forward that the automated lane keeping system has actually delivered to us isn't something it's delivered to us as drivers or general road users. What it's done is demonstrated that it's been possible at the UNECE to get the good folks who think about vehicle safety standards to step away from the traditional way they've thought of the vehicle, which is as a separate set of components, each of which can be tested in their own right, and to recognize that we're moving into a world where you've got to be able to understand the whole system, and you've got to be able to create a new testing approach and a new thought process for whether a vehicle is safe or not. And that brings with it a really big challenge, because it's possible to check whether something is, in engineering terms, safe. Use that term fairly broadly, but you know, the old vehicle type approval system is very much about, do the brakes work? Are the headlights bright enough? Are they too bright? Those sorts of things. But when you're talking about a vehicle and whether you're talking about a technology which is taking its own decisions. How do you test whether that approach is, in some sense, safe? And in particular, looking ahead to a more advanced form, perhaps even now, our beloved Secretary of State for Transport has said he's very interested in getting the automated lane keeping system certified to operate at least 70 miles an hour and to be potentially able to operate in more circumstances. But it's operating with what we call artificial intelligence. It's learning, it's developing, and it's deciding perhaps tomorrow that it will behave in a different way to the way it behaved today. How on earth do you type approve that? Similarly, if you think even today, let's step back from a driverless future and step into the driving seat of a rather nice Tesla Model S, even a Model 3, but let's step into a Tesla Model S because they're nicer, and I've driven one of those, and I have to say that is without question the fastest accelerating car I ever not just wish to be in, but fear to be in, because it certainly scared the willies out of my passengers when I tried to see how well it would go. But my point is this: Tesla does over-the-air updates. That means it updates the systems on which the car operates over the air, remotely, overnight. That means sometimes what they're doing is an update to the what's called the infotainment system. It's going to make it easier to tune into the Archers on Radio 4 or whatever it is you do when you're in your car looking for entertainment. But other aspects of those over-the-air updates actually affect the vehicle performance. So in the olden days, and I'm not going back very far here, I'm looking at Steve Norris here and thinking about our time with the likes of DVSA and the Vehicle Certification Agency, where you were able to take a car and you would take it somewhere, take it to one of the labs, maybe at Gaydon, and you could check all sorts of mechanical performance. And then when you're done, that was it. So apart from a bit of wear and tear, your brake pads need to be replaced, your windscreen washers need to be replaced. That's understood. With over-the-air updates, the very performance of the vehicle can change overnight. And that's something which our type approval system is really wrestling with, I would say. And it's an aspect, when you think about that applied to a driverless future, we have a past that is a past that's built on spanners and a future that's built on code. And the amount of code, if any of you on this call have a car that was built within the last 10 years, chances are the amount of code built into the way your car operates is about somewhere between 10 and 100 times the amount of code that we had available to put a man on the moon back in 1969. And it's growing all the time. And the code is changing because the code can develop itself. How do we type approve this? It's a huge challenge. So, point one, that's something that I know folks at the Transport Department, not just in our country, but across the world, are racing with. The regulatory authorities, as is ever the way, are racing to catch up with the automotive and indeed the non-traditional automotive clever folks like Elon and his company who have come into this field, who are developing technologies that are running ahead of the regulatory world, because the regulatory world is trying to work out, how do you test whether this is safe? And how do you establish whether it's safe today, but the capacity that the operator has to change it in some aspect tomorrow means it will still be safe? Our whole world of type approval and conformity of production and market sampling needs to move on. Okay, so let's move on to my second point. My second point is about partial autonomy. A lot of the talk about a driverless future envisages vehicles in which, well, you or I don't drive them at all well and good. But a lot of it is also about a vehicle that can drive itself some of the time. Now, not that long ago, I quite often had to drive from my home, which is south of Gatwick Airport in Sussex, up to Leicester. Nothing wrong in that. But had it been the case that I could have pulled onto the M23 and pressed a button and had the car drive itself up to Leicester without me having to think about it, I would have pressed that button. The first few times, quite interesting. And I have to say, I like driving, but you can have enough of the M25, I have found. You can certainly have enough of the roadworks on the M1. So I would have loved to press that button. But the point I kept making to my friends in the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles and to others was, if I could have pressed that button, chances are by about the third or fourth junction up the M1, at the very least, I would probably be what you and I would regard as fast asleep. Not just snoozing lightly. I'll be gone. I mean, I've heard The Archers. I don't know what talking book I'd be listening to. I don't know what I'd be doing. It's hard enough to stay awake when you're stuck in reasonably free-flowing traffic on a road you've been up and down many, many, many times. And what worried me was the idea that I was being told was likely, which is, what if the car encounters a circumstance that it can't cope with, which could be a crash ahead of it, or much less dramatic, it could simply be the onset of a heavy thunderstorm. A heavy thunderstorm, a lot of rain, a lot of standing water. The car can't quite work out what's going on around it. Now it's time for you to step back in. Well, I decided not to give you a slideshow today, but I have a clip from an animation a while ago of Porky Pig being awoken in Looney Tunes cartoon by an alarm clock. And I chose that because that's pretty much what I look like when I've been awoken from a sleep and I'm not quite ready. Now, I'm just telling you this. The last person that you want driving a car is me after you've just shaken me awake. And more to the point, you've just shaken me awake to be told the car doesn't know what it's got to do because we're in this crisis situation. This is not a good state of affairs. My view is, if we're going to have partial autonomy where the vehicle could encounter circumstances where it finds it hard to cope, the vehicle has actually not got to be designed in that way. I think the vehicle's got to be designed so that it could get itself to a safe space. And I still say I'm very concerned if that safe space is defined as being on the carriageway. But if, for example, we get within 5 miles of Leicester and there's a torrential thunderstorm, I'd be perfectly happy if my car said, I'm going to take you to Leicester Forest East. Once we've parked at the motorway service area, I'm going to sound an alarm, and then you're going to get out and go and get yourself a coffee and wake yourself up. Then and only then, when you get back into the car and you've satisfied me, the car, that you are fit to drive, will we set off again? And it is the case that some of the technologies being developed would allow the car to decide whether you're fit to drive rather than vice versa. The car will sense whether you're holding the steering wheel. The Tesla Model 3 will sense whether you're moving the steering wheel. Some cars will already sense your retinal movements. Are you actually awake? Do you look awake? What's your heartbeat? There are all manner of tests that the vehicle might run to check whether you're in as good a state as you need to be, or at least, let's put it this way, a better state than the car is itself to drive itself. Now, I don't know how all of you feel about that. I worry sometimes that my car would generally take the view that I'm never actually in a better state to drive it than the car is to drive itself. We'll come back to that if you want to. But there are different thoughts about this sort of, when could we have the vehicle running in automated form or when not? So I've drawn a distinction here between BMW and Audi. So the chief executive of Audi has said the bit of driving I like is the bit I do on the Autobahn, because then I can go really fast. Whereas the bit that I really find boring is when I come off the Autobahn and I'm threading through city traffic. So what I want is an automated system that allows the car to drive me the last 5 miles and then park itself, and I'll drive on the motorway. BMW and some others, it's the other way around. Now, personally, I think that I will find myself in a self-driving car on a motorway before I die. I'm just saying I should probably put a different time band on that. In the next 10 to 15 years. You never know about these things, do you? But I could imagine myself doing that. I can imagine that more clearly than I can imagine the opposite, which is I'll find myself in a self-driving car in a city, in a built-up area, in a place where the car has got to take account of any number of things, not least, and let's bear in mind the changes that have come into the highway code this month, that at junctions, the new highway code says the pedestrian has precedence over you, as does the cyclist who's coming up on the inside. So are we going to be able to have a technology that really copes with that? Well, I wonder. And I've spoken to, I think the phrase is, but actually I've listened to a lot of people in the industry, in the traditional auto industry, the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, and in the ITS world. And mostly they're a bit more reticent, shall we say, about the idea of a fully autonomous car, a car that can go anywhere, anytime, on any road, being with us anytime soon, than they are about high levels of automation, or what we might think of as super plus driver assist systems. Well, some of those are coming. In the first place, we're probably going to see them beyond the automated lane keeping system is on the Mercedes S-Class, because let's face it, that's where we see most brand new, exciting techie things coming our way. And what we're going to see is quite how the German approval authorities cope with approving these technologies for safe use. And then maybe we'll row in behind them. My next thought, this is about realistic use cases, and it came up as some of us were joining the conversation, is much of the interest, much of the debate has focused on the idea that we would have driverless motor cars like the ones we currently own. And indeed, that they might be cars that we do own, but they just happen to be driverless. They just happen to offer that as an option. They're probably still going to have a steering wheel in much the same way as you can buy a car now and it's got an automatic gearbox, but you could choose to put it back into manual, and you can use flappy paddles on the steering wheel, and you can turn off the various driver assist systems that the vehicle has got. But out there in the commercial world, there are other uses for non-driver technologies, which probably are going to have a stronger pull. I'm thinking here, for example, about the mind-numbing tedium of driving a combine harvester, or a tractor ploughing a field, or a vehicle working within a very large quarry or building site, where we are already seeing this technology coming into play, certainly around the world, certainly in Australia. And I long wondered whether, instead of thinking about the private car, we should be thinking more about some other use cases. For example, well, what about the good old bus? Here we have a vehicle that, by and large, is following a set route. It's doing the same route several times a day. That route could be very closely mapped, very well understood, could be fed into the vehicle. There can be a monitoring arrangement for it. So instead of thinking of a car as we think of it today, maybe we should be thinking about different sorts of vehicles that the driverless technology could enable, that might come into being over the next, I'm going to say, just because I don't want to say 10 years, 15 to 20 years time. We're under a lot of pressure from the government to think twice about owning cars, about using cars, about choosing more sustainable modes, and in particular about going back to public transport. Well, let's see what COVID and our concerns about that does, and let's see what the pressure to have us all working from home does about that. But I've long thought that one of the more interesting prospective uses of driverless technologies would be of the bus of 2030. And not just the idea that a vehicle might turn up to pick you up without a driver being in it, but turning the model on its head and thinking laterally. So I remember, and I'm guessing just by having a glance around the screen here, many of you will remember that back in the day, a double-decker bus had a driver who was in a hermetically sealed little cab up at the front, and it had a conductor. And the conductor would come and check your ticket and basically hang off the back of the bus on the platform and, generally speaking, smoke a cigarette and make cheeky remarks. Well, we don't need all of that back. But what if the advent of driverless technology meant we could have a public service vehicle where no driver is needed, but there could be somebody who was the equivalent of the conductor? Would that perhaps help with some of our other policy concerns about public transport? For example, about the concerns women, and frankly, I have about travelling on buses late at night. Some of us really don't want to be on the top deck of a bus by ourselves late at night, or rather not by ourselves, but with other people who may or may not be in a very fit state to be travelling. Would it perhaps be more comforting to know there was somebody on the vehicle and they weren't trapped in a hermetically sealed cab at the front of the vehicle, but were actually there, keeping an eye on things, making sure everyone was safe and happy and knew where the next stop was and what was happening? And I think, if we think again, one of the use cases I've heard a great deal about is, wouldn't it be fantastic for disabled people if we had driverless technology? Because that would enable them to get out and about in a way they can't today. They can't have a car now, they can't drive a car now, but this would make all the difference to them. Well, at the foundation, we did commission some work on this. Clive knows this because we did the work with the Royal College of Art students who went out and did some research. And one of the key things that came out of that was, it's all very well to think a disabled person doesn't need to drive the vehicle, but who's going to help them to get out of the house? Who's going to help them to get into the vehicle? My mother, in her later years, would occasionally get a minicab. One of her problems was minicabs, generally speaking, were saloon cars, and she found it extremely difficult to climb down into the saloon car. Not every minicab driver wanted to get out and help her. Well, a driverless minicab would to her have been next to useless, because she would have struggled to get in. There isn't anyone there to help at all. Well, the fact that the vehicle can drive itself doesn't take away the need for a person, or maybe some other really clever technology that I haven't encountered yet, to help the person access the vehicle. And that's what I think we need to keep in our minds. So we thought about realistic use cases. Yes, lots and lots of money is being thrown at a driverless technology for something that you and I would think of as a car today, and a car that we might own or aspire to own. But a lot of the commercial interest in the technology is coming not from private car use on the public road, from off-road uses, from agriculture, commercial uses, and from public service vehicle uses. And I would also throw into this mix the fact that in the world of logistics, there are few people more attuned to the bottom line than the fleet manager of a logistics company. And what that person will know is that one of the key costs, and one of the key, frankly, risks to their business is the human element. Drivers cost money. Drivers need to be looked after. Drivers have to stick with their drivers' hours limitations, and drivers, A, make mistakes, and B, get ill. So wouldn't it be lovely if the vehicles that were carrying stuff weren't trapped in that world, weren't subjected to drivers' hours limitations, were able to go wherever, whenever, and just keep going? You've still got to work out how to get stuff on and off. And one of the more interesting projects that Zenzik, the spin-off from DFT and Bayes some time ago, was getting interested in was if you wanted to automate the process by which retailers got deliveries out of normal hours, how would you do it? Because you can automate the vehicle, but if you can't get stuff off the vehicle and into the premises, then you haven't really achieved very much. So what would a docking mechanism be? How do we think beyond the vehicle? And that's what I'm thinking about here, that if we continue to think about a driverless future and what a vehicle might be like, or particularly what the vehicles that you and I choose to drive today might be like, we might be missing the bigger picture. We might be missing an opportunity because it's not just about the vehicle, it's about the vehicle, the system, the interaction between the vehicle, what it's carrying, and where what it's carrying needs to get to, which is, of course, what logistics, it's what the Honourable Carmen, obviously, all think about all the time. So I thought I'd end just with a bit of a reflection on this driverless future. Well, for some, definitely, it's a future that they crave. In fact, they crave a car-free future. I was listening to a program on Radio 4, again, just a day or two ago, about concerns, particularly amongst environmentalists, that we've come to regard the private motor car as the default means of transport for almost every trip that we make. And that has a big carbon footprint. It has an air quality challenge attached to it as well. So maybe we should wean ourselves off that idea altogether. Well, I'm not sure that we want to wean ourselves off that idea altogether. Those of us who actually like our cars, not just the trips that we make on them, not just the mundane trips, but the fact that we own them and that we look after them and we enjoy driving them. I'm looking at John Moran here. As someone who I happen to know has much the same feeling about his cars as I have about the motorbike I've got parked out in my garage.
Absolutely.
Maybe we need to be thinking again in a different way about the car and the role that it plays for us, so that we don't think of it as the default means of getting from A to B, even if it's just one of us and we're just making a mundane trip, if there's an alternative, or indeed whether we need to make that trip at all. I have learnt over the last, how long is it now, 20 months, that it's entirely possible to have almost anything you can think of delivered to your house. I have sat in this room trying to engage in very important conference calls, only to be disturbed by an array of people ringing the doorbell to announce that some new thing that I didn't know I'd bought, but I did turn out to have paid for, being delivered to my house, be it a pair of socks up to a greenhouse. I'm not making that up. A different pattern of trips, but maybe in this future, it isn't driverless. It's less driver, less driving. That's the thought that I was going to close on, that I would like to think that those of us who like driving will be able to do it in moderation, not all the time, not on every trip, but we will be able to do it in the future, maybe still beyond 2030, 2040. I have no current plans to hand back my ignition keys. I might, though, be quite tempted to get on a driverless pod and frankly, if I find myself ever going on an overseas holiday again, I might well find myself doing that at Heathrow Airport or Gatwick Airport after I've arrived on a shuttle. And does it bother me that the shuttle doesn't have a human driver? Probably not. Probably no more than it bothers me that the Docklands Light Railway doesn't have a human driver on most of its services. So there we go, Clive. Paul, they were my thoughts. I hope that was something of interest to you. I'm very happy to join in a conversation, take questions, challenges, or whatever comes to mind of the people here present. And I'm very sorry that I completely overran my allotted 20 minutes.
I suppose I should say, first of all, I'm in the I like driving camp with you and John. I heard one of these lectures a number of years ago, and it was being given by one of the people who was writing the software for an autonomous car. And one of the dilemmas they have is the car is in control. It comes to a point where there is an issue. If it does one thing, it injures the occupants. And if it does another thing, it injures the pedestrians that it's perhaps trying to avoid. So it is that sort of dilemma as to what do you do? Do you protect and get the software to protect the occupants, or get the software designed to protect pedestrians? And I'm just wondering where that sort of software has got to, if you know whether there's been any sort of development, perhaps from a legal point of view on that, how the systems are being designed, who it's going to put at the top of the list, and who might come maybe as not so important in the car's view.
Okay, I'm happy to respond to that. I can see Mary's got a hand up as well, so we'll come to you straight after. What I would say on this is two things. So first up, if you're interested, the law commissions have been doing a lot of work on this over the last 2 years. Their report to government on what the framework for automated driving should be was due, I think, to be published before Christmas. I suspect it will come out later this month. And it will pick up what I think it's called the tram dilemma or something like that. My view is it's an interesting sort of philosophical question, but at heart, the challenge for the designers of the software is not what should you do if the car finds itself in that situation. It's what do you need to do to make sure the car doesn't find itself in that situation? So why would it be the case that the vehicle was going so fast when the dilemma arose that the choice was harm the occupant or harm somebody else? And my view is that the default will be it won't put itself in that position. The future doesn't involve going very fast, in my view, in this world. It's not going to look like one of those computer simulations of vehicles zipping around and missing each other by inches, particularly in built-up areas, because we don't want vehicles zipping around and missing each other by inches, because in those built-up areas, we're there walking around, we're there riding our bikes, our children are walking around. We're seeing an increasing adoption of 20-mile-an-hour zones in our built-up areas. It's becoming the default in Wales and Scotland. So I suspect, whilst it is something that bears thinking about, the circumstances where it would arise would be, I think, really quite rare. And I think the challenge for the designers, and not just the software designers, remember, we're also thinking here about the vehicle designers, that how would the vehicle put me at risk in a world where the vehicle itself has been designed to protect me at all costs? I have airbags to my front, to my sides, above, below. I've got a seat belt, crumple zones. I think the vehicle will probably in those extreme circumstances do whatever it takes to default to the least harm, and the thing that it will be most willing to harm will be itself.
Steve, you were talking about the sort of regulatory approval and instant software updates happening overnight. And wasn't there an example of Tesla removing the restriction on the distances that their batteries could go during one of the forest fires in the States? But moving away from cars for the moment, isn't there quite a lot we could learn from the aviation industry as far as this is concerned? And the Fed presumably does in theory control the Boeing updates. And I mean, that was also very flaky when it came to the various aircraft of the same model that kept on mysteriously disappearing, of course. And it does show the limitations of these things. But they don't really have to be updated overnight unless there's a genuine safety issue, presumably.
I think I'm not an expert on what updates Tesla has actually done. If I've got a concern, it's not so much what they have done, it's what they might do. And I don't want to actually point the finger at Tesla there. Any number of vehicles that you might buy today have the tech on them that would allow the auto company to reach into them. If you buy one of the more high-end Volkswagens or a BMW, you might well find, for example, that unless you subscribe to their services, you're not going to have some of the driver assist or some of the infotainment systems because they'll only be unlocked by you subscribing and by BMW therefore being able to, and I'll use the term in its broadest sense, reach back into the vehicle and turn them on. And I'm much less worried about the ability for them to do that than to do things which, on the face of it, could be entirely benign, to do something which enabled your engine, however that might be configured, electric or otherwise, to be more efficient, consume less power, all those sorts of good things. But to change the operating dynamics, particularly all the time that we're driving the vehicle ourselves, so that the vehicle you thought was going to behave in one way when you drove it turns out to behave another way. Now, turning to the other point you make, yes, there's a lot to be picked up from the aviation industry. Although it might sound odd, it turns out that it's a lot more straightforward to think about how to control the 747 a mile up in the air in the middle of windy conditions over an ocean than it is to control a Mini in South London. But the 747, yes, has got to cope with the weather, but by and large, it's not coping with other traffic. And it's not coping, by and large, with other traffic in volume operated by humans who very often make, well, let's just say they make mistakes. They make decisions that you might not have been expecting. And programming to address that isn't straightforward. But another thing I would have to say in this company that we absolutely need to learn from the aviation industry is what the aviation industry itself learned from the infamous crash of the Air France flight some years ago, which is if the driver, in their case the pilot, isn't spending enough time actually doing the flying, they're not going to be in a good enough state to take control of the aircraft when something goes wrong. And what we know from flight 447, was it, that the pilot had a huge number of hours of flying time, but a tiny number of hours of actually doing the flying themselves. And then when it came to things going wrong, the team in the cockpit didn't believe their dashboard. They didn't believe what they were seeing. The instruments were telling them it was dark and it was stormy. They didn't think that what was happening was what the instruments were telling them, and they did the precise opposite to what they should have done when the engines began to stall. Now, it's not a direct comparison, but I would say, as I was saying earlier, you don't want a driver to be retaking control of a vehicle if they've not been sufficiently in command of that vehicle at the time. And even at the higher ends of driver assist, I'm slightly concerned that I'm not doing enough to keep me engaged with the task. So the vehicle. I could have adaptive cruise control. I can have autonomous emergency braking. I've got lane assist. If I'm driving the latest Nissan Leaf, the Nissan decides whether I'm in lane or not and turns the steering wheel, whether I want it to or not. Is it any wonder in that circumstance that a driver may drift off, and that's not where you want to be if and when something happens that does require a quick reaction? And I'm old enough to remember when the advice from the Institute of Advanced Motorists was you might have a radio. Actually, I think what they said was you might have a wireless in your car, but you shouldn't really turn it on because you shouldn't be distracted by such things. You're in control of heavy machinery and you should be wide awake and watching what you're doing. And I think that's something very important that we've learned from aviation. And that's why I worry about that human-machine interface.
Well, first of all, Steve, thanks so much for what I think is a fascinating exposition of not just, where we are today, but all the challenges that we still have in terms of something that, as you say, a few years ago, we all thought we'd all be driving by now. I learned that I'd got an ALC system on my new car when I gently turned off at about midnight. I was coming back from the M3. I turned onto the M25 and I wanted to go onto the M4 to London, no traffic anywhere. As I gently turned towards the M4, my steering wheel wrenched me back onto a lane that I had no interest in being on. I wrenched it the other way and, without crashing into anything, got myself home, rang the dealer and said, "What on earth is this?" He said, "Oh, well, you've got this automatic lane assist business." And I said, "Can I turn it off?" And he said, yes, you can turn it off. And he showed me how to do it. What he didn't tell me was that every time I turned the car on, the first thing I had to do was to turn this damn thing off. Now, it was a classic example of a really good theory, which is that I might be very tired and I might slip out of my lane, in which case I'd be an enormous traffic hazard. I could crash into a barrier and possibly kill myself, which would probably be the best outcome, but I could also kill other people. The real truth is that I think you put your finger on it when you said that partial autonomy is probably where we've got to be. And it would make an awful lot more sense if we concentrated on understanding what drivers need to have on permanently to help them, and frankly, what they ought to use if they want to. My car's also got this auto park facility, and that's, very nice because in a tight spot, I want it to take the blame if it misjudges the car I'm, going to back into. I think all of these things sort of teach you that it's kind of one step forward, one step back. And for me, I'm much more interested in what's going to carry on, what's going to be fitted into my regular car, which incidentally is the type of car I want to drive. You ask a soccer mum how pleased she is at the idea of having to take a pod every time she's taken the kids to play football. Every time she's going to take all the kit out of the back and then, keep it somewhere at home and then put it back in the boot of the next little pod that comes along. She's going to tell me not to do that, thank you very much. There are all sorts of these things where it strikes me that what we ought to be looking at is what's really, truly valuable. I've got a head-up display that shows the speed limit and my speed. I'm addicted to it. It's a terrific facility. It's quite new. I don't know how many other colleagues on the call have got it, but I love that. And it's something I really would look for on any new car from now on, because I don't want to break the speed limit, particularly in London, where there's lots of 20s plenty limits around, and where, one wants to make sure it's not going to break the law. I was just thinking of a couple of other points that you touched on. One is the impact of bad weather or the absence of visible road markings on the current technology. Because when Mr. Musk says I could take a car from California to New York State without a driver, what he means is, provided that the sun was always shining, the road markings were always in very good order, and the machine could therefore make the automated decisions for which it's currently enabled. In many cases in this country, there's evidence that road markings are so obliterated that actually they're useless. I'm not sure how this technology works yet inside that. I'm sure there's an answer, but we're nowhere near it yet. And so for me, this idea of incremental progress, where we separate what we might want to use. If I were leaving somewhere at midnight, I might switch lane assist on if I knew I'd got it. I'd be very aware of it. It would probably help you to stay awake. And it was certainly like, that thing used to have an Audi, it's a long time ago, where after 2 hours, it sent you a signal that said, you've been driving for 2 hours continuously, and you might think about taking a break. I always thought that was a perfectly useful reminder, and it's something many drivers might want. So the thread of what I'm saying is I think advancing technology can be really, really helpful, but we're a long, long way from a driverless world in which we're not really in charge of the vehicle. I think you made that point very subtly, quite often, but very, very well. Just one final thought, and it's a chilling one as far as I'm concerned. It's a fact that throughout the world, more men are employed driving than in any other occupation on earth, including factory work of one sort or another, any other sort of hospitality work. More men are employed driving, whether it's trucks, cars, buses, whatever you want to think of. More men. Now, what are we going to do with all those people when we make them redundant? You talked about the OPO bus, the one-person operation. NOPO might be an interesting idea, but as you said, might be actually quite useful to have somebody on the bus as a human being to do human things. And to me, the answer that you gave to Nigel when you were talking about this business of who decides who to kill, if anybody, I thought was exactly the right answer. But the truth is, the other problem we haven't really solved is who is going to be the mind that makes these decisions? I'm not allowed to make them. I'd like to press a button that says, never kill me. I doubt that's going to be available in the suite of options that my vehicle is charged with. So who's actually going to be used? You mentioned it. Who are we going to sue? Who needs, it might be the person who gets injured. It might be my estate if I get killed. I think these are questions that politicians certainly will spend a long time debating before the technology, which may well be advancing faster than them, actually becomes capable of being used worldwide. That's all, just reflections. But thank you for what I thought was a really stimulating introduction to a hugely interesting topic.
Thank you. I just thought I could see several hands have gone up. So I'll just reflect very quickly on one of the points that Steve made, and then perhaps let other people have a say here. But there was I've heard a very interesting comedy sketch about the options for specifying what you want in your driverless vehicle, which would go from I want it to get me from A to B in comfort through to I want it to protect me in all circumstances. If faced with the last living leopard crossing the road in front of me with 2 children behind it, but it'll make me late for a meeting, just keep going. That one costs you more. I'm not sure we're going to quite get to that, but I think the creep of tech in the modern motor car sometimes owes as much to people doing things because they can, rather than doing things because we want them to. I drove the latest Nissan Leaf, lovely car, right? Lovely car. I've got nothing against, certainly against electric cars, but it was arguing with me when I was, in my opinion, wide awake. Now, as Steve has said, late at night, you're coming back from somewhere, you're on a motorway, and you're going to be on there for the next 5 junctions. Well, that's when I don't think I'd mind having the car taking command and sticking in lane. And yes, the car's got to have tech on it beyond cameras that sense where the lane markings are, because even on our motorways on a wet day, it can't see them. But if it's got a GPS system as well and an accurate map, it can do that. What I'm less sure is that I've decided I want to come off at the next junction, or for some reason I've decided I need to come out of this lane into the next one. Frankly, I'll decide that, thank you, if I'm awake and that's what I want to be doing. And I have encountered not just Steve, but a number of people, including the road tester in Auto Express, who was doing a review of the new Volkswagen ID3, the electric, all-electric car they've just introduced, where many of the clever systems can't be turned off. They default to the car's always going to know best. Traction control, car's going to decide you can't. We we're not letting you decide, because we've decided, we the Volkswagen engineers are better at this than you are. And well, I guess I'm probably in that class of people who is not quite persuaded of that yet.
There are issues around this, and I think the driving test and even additional training is something that needs to be looked at. There was a lot of issues when ABS first came out, that more accidents happened because people put their foot on the brake pedal hard, felt it vibrate, and actually most of the systems, even now, they still push back slightly to make you push even harder. And people thought, oh, that's working, and took their foot off the brakes and went in the back of the car that they would have missed. So I think we need to make sure that people know how to use these systems. The airline industry also has a lot of teaching in respect of the transition of mixed technologies, where people were going from fly-by-wire planes back to wired flying planes and swapping around. They had a lot of issues, and I think we could see that as well. And I also think that we need to look at, if we buy a car and it's updated overnight, does that invalidate our insurance? If I bought the 300 brake horsepower version that suddenly gets chipped overnight, officer, by Elon Musk, am I still insured for it? I think there are a number of issues there, but some great technologies, and I agree with yourself, of being able to turn them on and off as you wish is also another good idea. Thank you very much. Been very informative.
First of a couple of remarks to Steve Norris. I can assure you that Mr. Musk does stop me driving in bad weather and my car controlling me. He says, I can no longer control you, in not quite the same words, but effectively, the software has been upgraded not to work in doubtful conditions when it can't see. I have been a Tesla driver for some 5 or 6 years, and I found the Tesla updates to be absolutely fantastic. They have gradually removed my privileges of what I could do on the road legally, although I didn't do. It makes me drive much more safely now by actually controlling what I'm allowed to do, whether I'm allowed to keep my hands on the steering wheel, not, etc., etc. It really helps a great deal there. The other thing I would just say to Steve Gooding, thanks very much for that fantastic talk, absolutely amazing. I also have a Nissan Leaf, which my wife has as well. And I find Mr. Musk is much more intelligent than my Nissan Leaf. He does make me do things much better than my Nissan Leaf. I find my Nissan Leaf at times in automatic modes quite scary. They just haven't quite got there in the same way that Mr. Musk has. I think this is a question of evolution, and of evolution around in having driver assist. I believe I am a safer driver using my driver assists that I have in my Tesla. I think I use them with some discretion and intelligence. I've just driven up from Cornwall. That's why I was on my iPad and hadn't got quite tuned into my visuals. And I found there that driver assists weren't very good on two-lane roads because of the overtaking of the traffic. But where I find absolutely brilliant is, let's say, I think we've all been around Reading and around that area of the M5 when we've had 50-mile-an-hour limits and we've had to keep in our lanes there. Well, that's absolutely brilliant time in which to put yourself on lane assist and lane control and to keep the people in front of you. It just makes that thing so much safer, so much better, so much easier. But I'm also in trucks. Just supplied the first 2 all-electric 38-ton tractor units to be supplied in the United Kingdom. And there I know how much the software is gradually being used for helping drivers drive more safely. In many ways, with distance control, and it's going to be with lane and other things of other sorts. That is going to be an evolution. There are tests there with some of the vehicles that we're using, which are working. And so all I can say is this is something that's going to happen gradually in helping us evolve to safer drivers in safer vehicles. I've already had warnings when I've been going to become a little bit close to a vehicle in front, my software tells me with great violence that I'm getting too close to someone and makes me start to stop. It does those type of things, and it can be updated and changed so very easily over the word. But Steve Gooding, thank you so much for a very, very thoughtful and highly realistic way of doing things. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, as usual, all the people that are pushing this sort of technology are ignoring the fact that not all of us live in towns or cities or anywhere where there are things like buses and trains. And I've spent the day up until I came on here driving where the lane keeping doesn't work. In fact, the lane keeping hardly ever works because none of the roads I drive on have actually got white lines anyway. Even if some of them have got fairly dodgy white lines, but most of them have got no white lines at all. And for most of the day today, I've been driving my car where the satellite navigation screen is just showing a blank green area with a small arrow in the middle, which is me, because I've been off-road on a private estate and needing to obviously drive across grass anywhere where I need to go, something that, I mean, I can't possibly conceive could ever be automated. And so, you know, that those sorts of things are ignored completely by all this, if anything becomes in any way compulsory. And the other point, another point I would like to make too with the automatic lane keeping is, although I can switch it off, I mean, I've got 3 levels. One is where it actually keeps me in lane. 2 is where if I deviate from the lane, it gives me the shutter on the wheel. And the 3rd is it's turned off completely. But even when it's turned off completely, there's something going on in the background, because on our narrow country lanes, if I have to move as far to the left as I can, because there's something coming the other way on a narrow road, it actually pushes me back into the middle of the road, into the path of the oncoming vehicle. Or it would do if I didn't obviously prevent it. But you know, these things are okay for certain uses, and sort of level 4 automation is it where it talks about within the specified operational domain, may be fair enough. But level 5, it will never work for me.
Steve referred very briefly to urban areas and expressed scepticism. We were going to see driverless vehicles in urban areas. Now, a lot of people seem rather enthusiastic about driverless taxis, driverless delivery pods, and things of that kind. And I don't know what people think about that, but it seems to me to be very problematical, because the road network in urban areas is not homogeneous. It's very varied. Quite often, when you're driving on minor roads in a city, you give way to a vehicle coming the other way because there are not, in fact, 2 fully available lanes in opposite directions. I suppose you get to a situation where the highway, once you enter a certain area, takes over the control of the vehicle and takes you where you say you want to go without any intervention on your part. But I'm not sure that it's a world I would want to live in.
Can I offer a first thought on that, which is that there are driverless taxis already operating in some American cities. I think they might be operating in Houston. They're operating in environments where, let's face it, the car has long since become king. And it's not an environment that, for example, you would recognize if you lived in Islington, say, where some of the streets are very narrow, some of them are still cobbled. There are lots of people moving around at particular times of day. Now, would it be possible for an autonomous vehicle to cope in those circumstances? Well, possibly, but I'll take you back to the earlier point about the tram dilemma, which is in those circumstances, I think you need to program the vehicle to proceed with extreme caution. So unlike the cheerful London cabbie of my own experience, the driverless cab of 2030 will be going a lot more slowly, will be routinely giving way to people, even if it thinks they're about to cross the road, let alone if they're actually about to cross the road. But then it wouldn't surprise me at all if by 2030, places like the People's Republic of Islington had banned private cars altogether anyway by then. And so these vehicles might be the only ones moving around, and that might not matter.
That what we're all talking about in terms of driverless or autonomous vehicles is control. What we've heard is that control of the vehicle by the manufacturer or the fleet manager or whoever is all very well within limits, but there needs to be ultimate human control of that. And you mentioned off-road circumstances, quarries, farms, and so on, where it's easier to exercise the control, the vehicle's control, but there must still be a human element. Turning to logistics, I disagree with what was said earlier about all these unemployed HGV drivers. I thought we were actually 100,000 short of them in this country. If we were to focus on truck convoys with a driver able to control the convoy rather as a pilot is supposed to control a plane and so on, is there any evidence that the focus of research, legal regulation and so on is looking at that area where goods can be moved in greater volume by less humans with sufficient control allied to the vehicle control?
Well, I'm on the sounding board for the project I think you're referring to, which was being run by the Transport Research Laboratory. And it's on my to-do list to chase up how quiet it's gone recently, which I think is predominantly a COVID issue. It is, with current technology, perfectly possible to give the driver at the front of a convoy of trucks control over the convoy up to, I'm not quite sure how many trucks have been trialled. I think it's 3 or 4 at the moment is the most that have been controlled in that way. The questions really come with quite what that's doing for us, because when the convoy, if you like, the convoy breaks when the vehicles go their separate ways, if that's what they need to do, the driver still needs to be there. It's extremely boring to be stuck in the cab of truck 3. You can't see much apart from the back of truck 2. And yet at some point you need to be brought back into control. And we've talked a bit about how control is re-established, but it is certainly something that the law commissions have had in their sights to think about. And it's something I know that the folks who commissioned the project at TRL, so I think it was a combination of the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles and what was then Highways England, now National Highways, have commissioned. One of the issues for us in this country about platooning is that much of the business case for doing it arises from fuel savings, from reducing headways between trucks. If trucks have the right headway between them, as prescribed by the highway code, quite often they're driving further apart than the trucks that you and I would see today actually are. And so the fuel savings might not be as realizable as people had originally thought. But it's certainly something that's in people's sights. Where I think there is an interesting world to be thought about is less, if you like, the at-scale road train, and more the last somewhere between 1 and 3 miles, where we don't want the driverless 18-wheeler trundling down the road outside Jim Coates' house because it won't fit. But we might want that 18-wheeler to be coming into somewhere, and then the vehicle into which the goods are then placed is itself something that is capable of highly automated operation that would leave a person potentially, and this was one of the trials that took place in Greenwich about 3 years ago. A person brings the pizza to your door, the driverless vehicle brings the pizza and that person to your street.
Thank you very, very much, Steve. A massive thank you from all of us. Very, very illuminating message and talk, and I'm sure it will take us all perhaps a little bit more time to digest some of the words and the discussions that have gone on here this afternoon. I'm sure they will continue to ring out for some time, and it's sort of been a massive help to make us all focus on this on this subject. And we thank you very, very much. And the research and development that you've done over the last years, has been, obviously we can see, has been immense. And thank you very, very much for that. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm sure we all look forward to seeing how all of these things become a reality in the coming years. And please remember to join us on the 1st of February at 4 o'clock when we have Sir Peter Hendy, who will tell us all about the rail futures. We've been very, very fortunate in Carmen with Clive and the Education Committee putting together this massively esteemed programme of lectures, and we've been very, very fortunate in the calibre of the lecturers that we've been able to attract. And thank you very much to Clive and the team for that. In the meantime, on behalf of everyone at Carmen and the Education Committee, we wish you all a very happy New Year. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.